Hi guys, it's Hannah from the Between Lewis and Lovecraft podcast here with another video for y'all today. And if you haven't already listened to it, our latest episode focuses on memoirs. Specifically, we talk about the book The Art of Memoir by Mary Karr, who is a poet and very, very prominent memoirist. She wrote not one, not two, but 3 memoirs. So she kind of knows what she's talking about. And in her book, The Art of Memoir, she kind of examines other people's memoirs, looks at what works, what doesn't work. She talks about how people respond to memoirs as readers, what we find believable, what we like, and offers lots of tips for people who might be thinking about writing their own life stories out. Definitely a very interesting read, particularly if you're thinking about ever trying your own hand at writing memoir. So definitely go check that episode out. But recording it got me thinking about some of my own favorite memoirs that I've read over the years. So I wanted to talk about a few of those today in no particular order. So the first one I'm going to talk about is kind of a heavy one. It's The Sun Does Shine by Anthony Ray Hinton. Now, Anthony Ray Hinton spent 30 years on death row for 2 murders that he did not commit. So yeah, definitely a really serious topic. He spent all of those decades trying to prove his innocence and get back to his family. And it's just a really harrowing account of his time in prison and just the awful appeals process that he went through over and over again until finally, with the help of Bryan Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative, he was finally set free. I'm gonna be real with y'all, this book is hard to read, but I think that's why everybody should read it. It took me a long time to finish the audiobook. I had to stop it a lot because I was just so angry and upset. So it took me a lot longer to finish than it would normally take me to read a book. My sister, on the other hand, finished the book in one night. Now, that might not sound that impressive, except my sister really does not like to read. I am always suggesting books to her, and she just doesn't really care. So this one, I didn't even suggest it to her. She just kind of asked me about it, and I gave her the Cliff's Notes version, and was like, I'm going to be honest, I don't think you're really going to like it that much, but she told me to get it for her anyway, so I gave it to her, and she sent me a Snapchat at 3 a.m. the next morning with tears coming down her face, because she read it all in one night and was just so emotionally wrecked by it. And then she made my mom read it. So yeah, we've all read this book. It's a really tough read, but it is really worthwhile. And Anthony Ray Hinton is just such an inspirational person in how he was able to keep his faith and hope alive under the worst circumstances possible. And it's also just a really kind of bleak look at the American justice system and what we can do better. So I highly recommend The Sun Does Shine by Anthony Ray Hinton. The next book I want to talk about is Educated by Tara Westover. Chances are, if you read memoirs, you've heard of this book. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for more than 2 years. Barack Obama named it one of his favorite books of the year. Oprah Winfrey talked about it. Ellen DeGeneres talked about it. Bill Gates wrote Tara Westover's entry in the Time Magazine 100 Most Influential People list. So yeah, it's kind of a big deal. But it does kind of live up to the praise. It's a really good book. And if you haven't read it, here's what it's about. Tara was raised in a Mormon survivalist family in rural Idaho. Even among the people in their church, they were kind of looked at as the weird family because her father was like this doomsday prepper. He didn't believe in formal education, so he kept the kids out of school. And he didn't believe in traditional medicine, so no doctors for them, even when they really needed them. There are some really graphic injuries that people in that family suffered, and I have no idea how they managed to survive as well as they did. So that means Tara didn't really get an education growing up. There were some points when her mom sort of homeschooled them, but most of the time there was just nothing. So Tara kind of taught herself some things. She studied really hard on the ACT, and somehow got into Brigham Young University. So it chronicles her childhood and then also just kind of the shock of going from that home environment to a college. And then even beyond that, Tara went on to get her doctorate degree in intellectual history from Cambridge University. So it's just a really incredible story. Her memoir really focuses on 2 things, I think. One being the complicated family ties that all of us experience to some degree. Maybe not as dramatic as her experience, but they're all there. And then the other thing it looks at is what it truly means to be educated. Another thing that really stood out to me about Educated, and we talked about this a little bit on the podcast, is how compassionate she is to the characters in her book. It would be really easy for her to lash out at or make fun of her parents and the rest of her family for their kind of what most of us would consider to be crazy beliefs. But she doesn't. She approaches them with a lot of understanding, and I think that's something that a lot of great memoirists have in common, is that they aren't condescending and that they kind of paint the people in their lives with the most generous brush. I think Educated is just a really good book, and yeah, you should definitely read it. The Glass Castle by Jeannette Walls kind of reminds me of Educated in tone, but the two women had very different lives. It's been a while since I read it, but if I remember correctly, The Glass Castle opens with this really riveting scene of an adult Jeannette Walls riding in a car in New York City to some sort of fancy event, and then she looks out the window and sees her mom rummaging through a dumpster, very clearly homeless. So it's got that striking image in the first scene, and then it kind of goes back and chronicles her tumultuous childhood. Her family would move around at the drop of a hat, sometimes leaving in the middle of the night whenever her dad lost a job, which was a lot. Her parents were very unstable, not really good at being parents, not really interested in being parents sometimes. So it's just this really interesting, fascinating story of them crisscrossing the country, living all over the place, meeting all sorts of interesting people, and then finally how Jeannette and her siblings kind of got out of this situation, and then what happened when they were adults and found out that their parents had followed them to New York City but were living on the streets. I have two parents who are still married to each other, grew up middle class. Reading stuff like this is just fascinating to me. And Jeannette Walls does a really good job of telling her story and kind of capturing the different people that are out there, really, and giving us this eclectic group of characters from her own life. There's also a movie. It was made into a movie in 2017 starring Brie Larson, Naomi Watts, and Woody Harrelson. I haven't seen the movie, but if you have, I'd like to know your thoughts on it, so feel free to leave a comment on that after this video. Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance was a book that I had been meaning to read for a long time before I actually did. I finally saw it at the library one day and I was like, oh, why not? I'm so glad I read it. J.D. Vance leads us through his childhood, introducing us to real people who could be described as colorful at best and batshit crazy at worst, but most really fall somewhere in between. So in this book, J.D. Vance describes his upbringing and family life. He was born in Ohio, but traces his roots to rural Kentucky. So he gives us this look at Appalachia and the values that you'll find there, like love and loyalty, but also some of the societal problems like alcoholism, abuse, violence, drug abuse, and stuff like that. And so he was really pushed by his grandparents, specifically his grandmother, to rise above, to leave rural Ohio and kind of climb the social ladders, eventually attending Yale Law School. So Vance is looking back on his childhood and his upbringing through that lens, and it would be really easy for him to be kind of condescending, sort of like it would have been easy for Tara Westover to be condescending toward her family. But he's really not. He gives us this critical yet compassionate view of people who are living in these rural areas and struggling. And while he does point out several ways that we could do better as a society and as individuals, he doesn't oversimplify the matter as just like study hard, pull up your bootstraps, and you'll get out of poverty magically. I think you should really read this book if you're a hillbilly, but you should really, really read this book if you're not, and especially if you don't even know anyone who could be described as a hillbilly. I'm looking at you, urban elites. I think it's easy for us to kind of get stuck in our echo chamber, so it's good to read books about people who are from wildly different backgrounds from us. And I would definitely consider Hillbilly Elegy one of those books. So the next one on my list is a book that I actually have, and I read I Am Malala in 2016, so I referred to my book review that I wrote at the time to kind of refresh my memory on this. So, for those who don't know, Malala Yousafzai is the Pakistani girl who pursued an education, and in return, she got a bullet to the face courtesy of the Taliban. Fortunately, she survived and went on to write this memoir. She and her co-author do a really, really good job of telling it. It would be easy for the parts about history to get really convoluted, but the two authors summarize the complex history of the Middle East, as well as the tensions between Shias and Sunnis, and the Taliban's rise to power in a really conversational tone that doesn't bog down the story at all. Above all, I Am Malala offers a moving look at the human faces behind the wars that we see on TV, as well as the bravery of young women everywhere fighting for something that we, and I in particular, have taken for granted our entire lives. My last recommendation is kind of a two-part recommendation. The first part is Black Privilege by Charlamagne the God. Now, I first found out about Charlamagne the God from watching MTV's Girl Code, and that's a whole other story. My dad and I tend to watch shows that we wouldn't normally be expected to. I'm looking at you, Bachelor. So we watch these shows that are kind of kooky, but then we end up really liking them. MTV's Girl Code, which I don't even know if it's on anymore, but it was sort of like that. It had like an ensemble cast of like comedians and other personalities talking about things. Charlamagne the God was one of them. So that's where I knew him from. He's probably best known, though, for the show that he hosts called The Breakfast Club, which has been on for a long time. So in Black Privilege, Charlamagne uses his life experiences to impart wisdom to his readers in a way that only he can. And I mean that in that, like, he uses a lot of adult language and talks about a lot of adult scenarios. So if you're a sensitive person who doesn't like swearing or like graphic depictions of sexual activities, then I would not recommend this book. But if you can stomach that, he'll impart a lot of wisdom on you through gems like fuck your dreams if they aren't really yours, put the weed in the bag, and live your truth, which are a few of my favorite chapters in that book. For anyone who feels like they're lost or struggling to get where they want to be, his book is a much needed kick in the pants. He doesn't mess around with self-pity or laziness. He's the literal representation of hustle. And he's able to give this advice because he really lived this journey. He grew up poor in South Carolina. He was dealing drugs at one point and went to jail more than once. So he came from this background where you wouldn't necessarily expect him to be successful, but he took those life experiences and he really built himself up. And I think Black Privilege kind of shows you the importance of staying humble and being kind to everyone because you don't know what they're going through. It's also got some good career advice because Charlamagne talks about his rise through the ranks in radio. So it gives you a good look at the importance of treating everyone nicely there too, because you never know who's going to end up being, kind of a bigwig and who could help you either get a job or could ruin your chances if you weren't nice to them. And then the reason this is a two-part recommendation is because just this past week I listened to the audiobook of Charlamagne the God's second book, Shook One, Anxiety Playing Tricks on Me. This is a really quick read or listen. It's, again, sort of a memoir, but also kind of like a self-help book almost, because he uses his life experiences to frame a discussion around mental health and his own anxiety. I think it's a really unique way of writing a memoir, of structuring it, and I also think it's really important to have these prominent people, these celebrities, using their platform to talk about the importance of mental health, especially in Charlamagne's case, because he's writing this specifically looking at African American males who might be reluctant because of their culture and upbringing to seek help for mental health problems. So I think it's really, really great that he's talking about his own struggles with anxiety and how he finally got the courage to get help for them and just the challenges that he faces even today. He talks about how he chose his therapist and how important it is to treat therapy like you would treat physical health. And then another really interesting thing about the way this memoir is constructed is he has the psychiatrist Dr. Ish write kind of a clinical evaluation at the end of every chapter. So you've got Charlamagne presenting his life stories and incidents where he struggled with anxiety, and then you've got Dr. Ish looking at this is why Charlamagne felt this way, and these are some other things that people might feel. So I think it's just a super interesting memoir. I like that it's not just, the start of someone's life, middle, end. I like seeing creativity and how memoirs are approached and how memoirs are structured. So I really, really like this one. And it's kind of a fun read or listen. I would really recommend the audiobook because Charlamagne reads it, which gives you that whole extra experience. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you have a favorite memoir that I didn't mention, please leave it in the comments. I always love new reading recommendations and would love to check out something that you guys like. Also, if you haven't already listened to the latest episode of our podcast, I would definitely love it if you guys would check that out. Learn some more about memoirs and memoir writing. You can find us at Between Lewis and Lovecraft Podcast, wherever you listen to your podcast, Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, whatever. And then also find us on all the social media channels. I'll leave links below. And be sure to subscribe to this video so you don't miss any in the future. That's all I've got. See ya!